On a quiet November morning in 1989, a woman drove to a house she had never been welcome in. Let herself through the front door with a key she had borrowed from her own daughter, walked down the hallway in the dark, and pushed open the bedroom door. What happened next would end 2 lives, shatter a family, and turn Betty Broderick into one of the most discussed figures in American true crime history. She has now spent more than 3 decades behind bars. She has written a memoir, watched her story adapted for television, and continued to appeal her conviction. And still, when asked about that morning, she has never fully retreated from the conviction that she had been pushed beyond any point of return. To understand how Betty Broderick arrived at that bedroom door, it is necessary to go back to the very beginning, to a football game, a college party, and a first meeting that felt, at the time, like the start of something wonderful. Betty was 17 years old when she first encountered Dan Broderick. She had traveled to Indiana to watch a game at the University of Notre Dame, and the two met at a party connected to the trip. Dan was in his early 20s, preparing to begin his studies at Cornell University. By most accounts, the attraction was immediate. He was charming, intellectually driven, and funny, and Betty was drawn to all of it. When Dan eventually moved to New York to pursue his education, the two found each other again and began dating. What had started as a chance encounter at a football weekend grew into a serious relationship. Betty would later describe the early years with a mix of affection and certainty. She remembered Dan as ambitious, intelligent, and funny, and believed they recognized those same qualities in each other. They shared a Catholic upbringing, a hunger for success, and a clear picture of the future. Betty wanted motherhood. Dan wanted a demanding professional life. In the beginning, those dreams appeared to fit together. That detail matters because the Broderick story is often flattened into its final scene: a gun, a dark bedroom, 2 people dead. But nobody begins at the final scene. Betty began as Elizabeth Biseglia, one of 6 children in a strict Catholic household in New York. She grew up absorbing a familiar lesson for girls of her generation. A successful marriage was not merely one part of a good life. It was the structure that gave the rest of life meaning. You chose a promising man. You helped him rise. You raised the children. His achievement became the family's achievement, and the family became your proof that the sacrifice had been worthwhile. Dan, meanwhile, was pursuing an unusually demanding path. He trained first in medicine at Cornell, and then in law at Harvard, aiming for the specialized field of medical malpractice. Years before the money and the La Jolla address, there were tuition bills, frequent moves, small children, long absences, and the pressure of building a future that always seemed to require one more sacrifice in the present. Betty sold products door to door and cared for the household while Dan studied. She gave birth repeatedly. One baby boy died only days after birth. Grief entered the marriage at the same time exhaustion was already living there. Yet the bargain, at least as Betty understood it, remained intact. They were doing this together. When the education was finished and success finally came, all those difficult years would have a purpose. After completing her own education at Mount St. Vincent, Betty worked as a teacher. She and Dan married and began building the life she had described, a life centered on family and shared ambition. Children followed, and for a time the picture seemed to match what had been promised. But the cracks began to show early, and they widened significantly when the couple relocated to Somerville, Massachusetts, while Betty was pregnant with their second child. The move was disruptive, and the pressures of that period were compounded by personal tragedy. When Betty became pregnant a 3rd time, the baby died shortly after birth. Grief, distance, and the demands of Dan's continuing education placed enormous strain on the marriage. Dan was working toward a degree from Harvard, and the household was organized largely around his professional advancement. Betty managed the children and the domestic life while carrying her own grief and growing frustration. When Dan finally graduated, the family moved once more, this time to San Diego, where he joined a law firm and began building what would become a highly successful legal career. He eventually started his own practice, and the money followed. In San Diego, the Brodericks found a social footing that matched Dan's rising profile. They became embedded in the city's social scene. From the outside, their life appeared polished and enviable. Dan was a successful attorney, they had children, they had standing in their community, and they seemed to represent a particular kind of American achievement. Betty, however, experienced the interior of that life very differently. She has claimed that despite his professional success, Dan was not an engaged or active parent at home. Even after she took a job as a real estate agent, she has alleged that he refused to share in the responsibilities of raising their children. Whether or not those allegations fully reflect what happened inside the marriage, it is clear that something between them had grown deeply wrong. Success did not release the pressure, it changed its shape. The family moved into expensive homes. There were club memberships, parties, private schools, and the rituals of affluent San Diego. Dan became president of the County Bar Association and a formidable figure in a legal community built on reputation and relationships. Betty had the visible rewards she had been promised, but she also felt that the history behind them was vanishing. The work she had done at home could not be placed on a resume. There was no partnership title for the years of child care, relocations, and emotional labor. If the marriage failed, Dan would still possess his profession. Betty increasingly feared that she would be left with memories of helping him build it. Friends and relatives would later offer sharply different portraits of the marriage. Some saw Betty as funny, energetic, and generous before the conflict consumed her. Others remembered anger, volatility, and a need to control the family's emotional weather. Dan was described by supporters as disciplined and devoted to his children, and by Betty as cold, manipulative, and skilled at using money as leverage. Those accounts do not fit neatly together. Real families rarely do. What can be seen in the record is that their private war gradually escaped the house and entered answering machines, courtrooms, police reports, and the lives of their children. Then came Linda Kolkina. Dan met Linda through his law practice, where he hired her as a legal assistant. Betty was aware of Linda's presence in Dan's professional life. She had also, for some time, harbored suspicions about whether the relationship extended beyond work. Dan, by her account, consistently denied any infidelity, but it is understood that he and Linda did become romantically involved. The nature and timeline of that relationship became one of the central and bitterly contested elements of the divorce proceedings that followed. But for Betty, the emotional damage of believing herself deceived was already done long before anything was legally confirmed. Linda was more than 20 years younger than Betty. She had worked as a flight attendant before joining Dan's office, and she did not have formal legal training. To Betty, every detail seemed designed to humiliate her. She believed she was being asked to watch her replacement enter the professional world she had helped make possible, while Dan denied that replacement existed. This is where the word gaslighting often enters modern retellings. Betty said Dan insisted she was imagining the affair, even as his closeness with Linda became increasingly visible. Supporters see that denial as psychological abuse intended to destabilize her. Critics point out that Betty's later conduct cannot be explained away by what Dan did. Both points can be true. Being deceived can inflict deep injury. It does not transfer responsibility for the violence that follows. Betty tried to force certainty into the situation. She demanded that Dan fire Linda. At one point, she set deadlines and attached punishments, including damage to his clothing, when he did not comply. The marriage became a contest in which each side seemed to believe pressure would make the other surrender. Instead, every escalation made the next one easier. In 1985, Dan and Betty separated. He moved out of the family home. What came after was not a clean or orderly separation, but rather an escalating series of confrontations, legal battles, and emotional breakdowns. In June of that year, following his departure, Betty allegedly entered the family home and caused significant damage, shattering bedroom windows, spray painting the walls, the curtains, and the fireplace. The rage that the incident reflected was not, according to those who have studied the case, the rage of a single afternoon. It was the accumulated fury of a woman who felt her marriage, her family, and her sense of self had been systematically dismantled. The conflict soon developed its own machinery. Dan obtained court orders. Betty violated some of them. He imposed financial penalties when she left abusive messages or damaged property. She viewed those deductions as proof that he could punish her without consequence. He viewed them as the only language that restrained her. Every act became evidence for the next hearing, and every hearing produced fresh resentment. One notorious episode came when Betty drove her vehicle into the front of the house where Dan was living. No one was killed, but the act stripped away any remaining illusion that this was merely an ugly divorce. Police reports and restraining orders now sat beside financial declarations and custody motions. The boundary between intimidation and danger had begun to disappear. The answering machine recordings were especially damaging. Betty left streams of profane and threatening messages, sometimes knowing the children might hear them. The tapes gave future jurors something immediate. They did not have to imagine her rage from legal summaries. They could hear it. And once rage is preserved on tape, context has a difficult time catching up. The 4 children were trapped between 2 competing realities. Their mother told them she had been cheated, discarded, and separated from them through manipulation. Their father offered the stability of his home while documenting her behavior as dangerous. The children were not passive symbols in an adult argument. They were people forced to navigate loyalty, fear, anger, and love while the adults around them turned family life into evidence. As the separation extended into a prolonged divorce process, Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic and difficult to defend, even for those sympathetic to her position. She began dropping the children off at Dan's new residence, sometimes leaving them with all their belongings, effectively refusing to maintain the custody arrangements in the way a court might have expected. Dan took over the daily care of their 4 children during this period. The divorce itself was drawn out and, for Betty, relentlessly demoralizing. She lost court battle after court battle. She lashed out repeatedly in ways that damaged her own legal standing. By early 1989, the divorce was finalized. Betty lost custody of her children. It was a result she found devastating and, in her telling, deeply unjust. The financial settlement did provide her with $16,000 per month in spousal support and a $28,000 cash award, which was not insignificant, but the custody outcome represented a loss that no financial arrangement could address. Her children were now living primarily with Dan and with Linda, the woman Betty viewed as the person who had helped destroy her marriage. The money would become another fault line in public reactions to the case. $16,000 a month in 1989 was a large sum, and prosecutors used the figure to challenge the image of a woman left with nothing. But Betty's grievance was never only that she lacked cash. She believed the final calculation erased her contribution to Dan's earning power and reduced decades of partnership to numbers controlled by the legal system he understood better than she did. That belief explains the depth of her fury. It does not justify where she directed it. In April of 1989, Dan and Linda married. The wedding took place just months after the divorce was finalized. For Betty, who had spent years fighting the dissolution of her own marriage, and who blamed Linda directly for what had happened, the news of the wedding was another blow. Then November arrived. That month, Betty received 2 letters from Dan's legal team. The letters addressed her custody proposal and threatened legal action in response to it. According to accounts of her state of mind at the time, those letters pushed her to a place she had not been before. She has said that she began to contemplate suicide. She felt, by her own description, that there was no way forward, no legal recourse left to her, and no version of the future that she could bear. But she did not take her own life. Instead, she turned her intention outward. On the morning of November 5, 1989, Betty Broderick drove to the house where Dan and Linda lived. She had obtained a key to the home from one of her daughters, and she used it to let herself inside. She made her way to the bedroom. Dan and Linda were in bed. Betty opened fire. She fired 5x .38 caliber revolver. 3 bullets struck the couple. Linda was 28. Dan was 44. Betty later testified that she had gone there intending to confront them and then die by suicide. She said Linda shouted for the police and Dan moved toward the telephone, and that the gunfire followed in a state she could not clearly remember. prosecutors saw something far less ambiguous: a woman who armed herself, entered a locked home before dawn with a stolen key, approached two sleeping people, and shot them. One detail carried the bleakness of the whole crime. A bullet tore into the telephone. Whatever anyone in that room intended during those seconds, help was now farther away. Betty left without calling for it. Daniel Broderick and Linda Broderick died from their wounds. Betty left the house and contacted one of her daughters to tell her what she had done. She then turned herself in to the police. The community she and Dan had once been part of, the social world they had inhabited together, absorbed the news with shock. Whatever one believed about the years of conflict and alleged mistreatment that had preceded that morning, the outcome was undeniable and irreversible. 2 people were dead. Betty Broderick was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was also charged with the illegal use of a firearm. Her first trial ended in a hung jury, which itself became part of the public conversation around the case, with some arguing that it reflected genuine ambivalence in the public about how to weigh her history against her actions. The second trial produced a conviction. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life for the murders, and an additional 2 years for the firearm charge. The first trial began in 1990 and became a public referendum on more than the shootings. Betty took the stand and described years of emotional torment. The defense pushed jurors toward voluntary manslaughter, arguing that prolonged provocation had destroyed her ability to reason normally. The prosecution emphasized preparation, threats, vandalism, and the simple sequence of choices required to reach the bedroom with a loaded weapon. 10 jurors favored murder. 2 held out for manslaughter. The deadlock produced a mistrial, and the split revealed why the case would endure. People were not divided over whether Betty had fired the shots. They were divided over how much the road to the bedroom changed the legal meaning of pulling the trigger. At the second trial in 1991, prosecutors pressed harder on Betty's own account of the shooting. Jurors asked to rehear a long portion of her testimony during deliberations. This time, the compromise landed on 2 counts of second-degree murder, not the first-degree verdict prosecutors had sought, and not the manslaughter verdict the defense wanted. In February 1992, the judge imposed 32 years to life. The sentence delivered legal justice, but it could not produce emotional repair. Dan's and Linda's relatives had to listen as the dead were discussed as characters in Betty's explanation. The Broderick children had lost their father to murder and their mother to prison. Some supported the possibility of parole in later years. Others opposed it. Their different positions showed the private cost of a case the public often consumed as a debate. For decades after her conviction, Betty was held at the California Institution for Women. She became eligible for parole and was denied in 2010 and again in 2017. At those hearings, officials focused heavily on what they saw as a continuing failure to accept responsibility and show genuine remorse. To Betty, remorse seemed to require surrendering her account of the marriage. To the board, her refusal suggested that the thinking behind the crime had never truly changed. That created the final lock on her case. She could describe pain in extraordinary detail. She could explain what Dan had done, what the courts had done, what Linda represented, and why she believed herself trapped. But parole demanded a different explanation: what she had done, why it was wrong regardless of provocation, and how she had changed. The distance between those 2 stories kept the prison gate closed. At her 2010 hearing, that distance was impossible to miss. More than 20 years had passed since the murders, yet the board heard a woman who still located the central cause outside herself. Her pain remained vivid. Her language about responsibility remained qualified. Commissioners were not being asked to decide whether the divorce had been cruel. They were being asked whether she could safely live outside prison. In their view, a person who still understood the killings mainly as something others had driven her to do had not confronted the risk at the center of them. 7 years later, the answer was again no. By then, Betty was nearly 70. Age can reduce certain kinds of risk, but age alone is not insight. The board again focused on remorse, accountability, and the absence of a convincing explanation for how she would respond differently to injury or rejection. Release was denied for 15 years, pushing the next possible hearing to 2032. It seemed possible that time, rather than a board, would make the final decision. Her children were never united about what should happen. That may be the most honest measure of the damage. They had shared the same parents and the same catastrophe. Yet they carried different versions of what mercy required. Some publicly supported release, believing their mother was no longer dangerous and had served enough time. Others opposed it, seeing her refusal to accept responsibility as proof that the central wound remained open. None of them had the luxury of treating the case as entertainment. Whatever position they took, they had to take it as the children of the woman who killed their father. Prison life reduced the scale of the world Betty had once fought to control. The La Jolla houses, the legal filings, the social invitations, and the answering machine were gone. Days were governed by counts, schedules, institutional rules, and locked doors. Yet outside those walls, her story kept expanding. Strangers watched dramatizations and chose sides. They used her marriage to argue about gender, divorce, domestic abuse, privilege, and rage. Betty became a symbol large enough to obscure the actual aging woman living inside the consequences. There is an uncomfortable irony in that. During the marriage and divorce, Betty believed she was being erased. After the murders, she became impossible to erase, but only as the author of the worst thing she had done. The attention she once demanded arrived in a form that could never restore what she wanted. Fame did not return her children to an intact home. Sympathy did not alter the verdict. Every retelling began in a dark bedroom, no matter how far back it traveled to explain why she went there. The public debate also changed as the decades passed. In the early coverage, Betty was often packaged as the ultimate woman scorned, an image that could be mocked, feared, or sensationalized. Later audiences were more likely to recognize coercive control, financial power, and the psychological violence of sustained denial. That broader understanding was valuable. It gave language to injuries courts and families have often minimized. But it also made precision more important. A better understanding of abuse should sharpen moral judgment, not dissolve it. The clearest lesson is not that suffering inevitably produces violence. Millions of betrayed spouses endure humiliation, unequal legal fights, and devastating custody losses without killing anyone. Nor is the lesson that Betty's suffering was irrelevant because she eventually became violent. Ignoring the road prevents us from recognizing danger while there is still time to intervene. The lesson is harder. We must be able to take suffering seriously before catastrophe, and still hold the person who causes catastrophe fully responsible afterward. That distinction is also a form of justice for people living through destructive relationships now. They deserve to be believed before rage becomes dangerous. They deserve lawyers who do not exploit imbalance, families who do not dismiss warning signs, and support that does not require them to become perfect victims first. But help must widen choices, not excuse the choice to destroy another life. Betty's story shows what happens when grievance becomes the only identity a person can still inhabit. Every door begins to look locked. Every disagreement becomes persecution. Every consequence feels like another attack. The final violence may happen in seconds, but the thinking that permits it can harden for years. By the time Betty reached Dan and Linda's bedroom, she had crossed countless smaller thresholds. Each one had offered a chance to stop. That is what makes the ending tragic rather than inevitable. The case never left public consciousness. Betty contributed to its continued presence by publishing her version of the marriage and murders. Television movies appeared in the early 1990s. Decades later, documentaries, podcasts, and a prestige drama introduced the case to viewers who had not been born when the shots were fired. Each retelling arrived in a different cultural moment. Language around coercive control and psychological abuse had changed. So had the willingness to examine how unpaid domestic labor can disappear during divorce. But new language also created a danger. Understanding a person's suffering can slide into treating murder as the final episode of somebody else's wrongdoing. Linda can disappear almost completely in that version. She becomes the other woman, a plot function rather than a 28-year-old person whose future was taken. Dan becomes only the powerful husband Betty described, as if a flawed or cruel person can somehow forfeit the right to wake up alive. The responsible way to tell this story is to resist that slide. Context matters because it tells us how catastrophe developed. Responsibility matters because context is not permission. There is a version of Betty Broderick that her supporters hold on to, a woman who sacrificed her own professional ambitions to support a husband through his education and the building of his career, who raised their children while he worked, who was then discarded for a younger woman and subjected to years of legal defeat in a system where her husband's status as a prominent attorney gave him structural advantages she could not match. They point to the custody loss as a culminating injustice, and to the threatening letters in November as the moment that collapsed whatever restraint remained. There is another version, a woman whose behavior during the separation and divorce, including the property destruction, the harassing phone calls that have been documented in various accounts of the case, and the decision to leave her children at Dan's door, demonstrated a pattern of conduct that made the tragedy foreseeable, and that whatever mistreatment she experienced, it did not justify walking into a room where two people slept and shooting them. Both versions are held with genuine conviction by people who have followed the case, and both contain elements supported by the record. The courts have rendered their judgment. Betty Broderick was found guilty of second-degree murder, and she has remained in prison ever since. She has continued to contest that outcome through appeals, a posture that reflects either an enduring belief in her own innocence or an inability to accept the finality of what the legal system determined, depending on who is assessing her motivations. What is not disputed is the bare arithmetic of her situation. She spent more than 36 years in custody. She was a mother of 4 living children whose lives were altered permanently on the morning she chose to act. She was a woman who had, by her own account, spent years feeling invisible, discarded, and legally outmaneuvered. She was also a woman who made a decision that ended 2 lives and foreclosed whatever future she might otherwise have had. The story of Betty Broderick resists easy conclusions. It sits in a space that true crime often occupies uncomfortably, the intersection of genuine suffering and genuine violence, where the humanity of the person who caused harm cannot be separated from the reality of the harm itself. The debate that has surrounded her case for more than 3 decades is not really about whether what she did was legal or illegal. That has been settled. It is about something harder to resolve: how to think about a life that contained real injury on multiple sides, and what meaning to assign to the choices made within it. Dan Broderick and Linda Broderick are dead. Their deaths were not abstractions or dramatic devices, they were people, and the morning of November 5, 1989, ended everything for them. That fact anchors the story and cannot be qualified away, regardless of what preceded it. Then, on May 8, 2026, the question of whether Betty would ever leave prison was answered without another parole hearing. Weeks earlier, she had fallen and fractured ribs. According to her youngest son, Rhett, an infection followed and progressed into sepsis. Prison authorities said she had been transferred from the California Institution for Women to an outside medical facility on April 18. She died there from natural causes at 30:40 in the morning. She was 78 years old. 3 of her children were reportedly at her bedside. Another joined by video call. That image is quieter than the scene that made their family famous, and in some ways more painful. The children, now adults, gathering around the mother whose act had taken their father, and then taken her from them for almost 4 decades. Betty never walked free again. There was no 2032 hearing, no final argument before a parole board, no late chapter in which she returned to a world that had spent years debating her. Prison was not a temporary interruption to the life she had wanted. It became the place where that life ended. Her death did not settle the argument. Some people still see a woman broken by betrayal, coercion, and an unequal legal fight. Others see a long pattern of threats ending in an act of revenge she never fully owned. The record contains evidence that feeds both interpretations, but the moral center cannot depend on choosing one and erasing the other. Betty could have been wronged and still been responsible. Dan could have behaved cruelly and still have been murdered. Linda could have entered a relationship that caused pain and still have deserved the entire unwritten length of her life. The children could love their mother and carry damage caused by her. Human truth is large enough to hold all of that at once. That may be why the case survived every adaptation and every decade. It asks a question people instinctively want to answer with a clean verdict. When suffering helps explain violence, how much should explanation change judgment? The law supplied its answer in 1991. Second-degree murder. 32 years to life. Betty served that sentence until death. The emotional answer is less tidy. A marriage became a battlefield. A divorce became an obsession. Grievance became identity. Then one person decided that, because she could not control the ending, nobody else would be allowed to continue. The life Betty once described wanting. The husband, the children, the future promised when she was young, did not simply vanish when the divorce papers were signed. It was dismantled through years of betrayal, rage, retaliation, and choices. The final choice belonged to her. And when Betty Broderick died in prison, the most enduring truth was not that she had once been pushed too far. It was that pain may explain the road to violence, but it can never absolve the person who chooses to take the final step. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.